Hi, it's Dr. Saira. I want to talk to you today about the dark times. I studied many years ago with somebody who's from the Gardnerian tradition, which is a particular branch in Celtic spirituality, um, where it's a very earth-based tradition and very in tune with the cycles of nature and getting a lot of knowledge and wisdom from the land. And so, what I learned from this teacher is that there's some key festivals that happen throughout the year that mark the passage of time in the Celtic tradition. So, one of those is Beltane, and one of those is Samhain, and there's lots of other festivals as well. And so, the festival that's happening now at this time of the year is Samhain. And Samhain happens on October 31st, and it's the beginning of the dark times. And the way that it was taught to me is that this is the time of year in that part of the world where things are starting to close, right? So the days are getting shorter, the nights are getting longer, it's getting colder. The time of harvest is now past, so we've kind of harvested all the crops, and it's things are kind of going dormant for the winter. And this was marked in a very significant way in this tradition, and continues to be marked by those who practice the tradition today in this festival. And there's some of those threads of that in Canada, the United States. You see, Halloween, for example, is a festival that happens on October 31st, and it's about like the darkness and these like ghouls and goblins, and like where does all that come from? And so, if we look at one of the root traditions there, this Samhain tradition, which is the beginning of the dark times, and what we're doing is we're welcoming the darkness, right? And so in a lot of kind of Western philosophy, we think of dark as like bad or negative or wrong. But in many earth-based traditions, they recognize that dark and light are both necessary for balance and for human survival. Imagine if it never got dark, how hard it would be to sleep. I have a friend whose husband works sometimes up north in the Yukon, and there's stretches of time where it's very very bright for a lot of hours of the day and through the night, and it's hard for him to get adequate rest when there's no dark sky. There's like you know. Blinds and like different things you can do with indoor lighting to make sure that you get that darkness, but in the natural world, that balance of light and dark is really important. I know that there's certain types of plants that only bloom when there's long periods of dark, and then that like gives them what they need to be able to bloom. So darkness is not intrinsically a bad thing. It's important that we have balance. So why am I bringing this up today? Well, as we move through Samhain and enter into the dark times, the idea is that these next several weeks, these next few months, are a time for introspection, a time to go inward, and giving ourselves real permission to do that. And inward, I feel like there's layers, right, in the inner space. There's kind of the known internal, and then there's the great unknown and the great mystery that lies within. And so I would encourage you, kind of in line with the seasons, as we move into these dark times, these darker days, at least in Canada and the United States, and some places in Europe perhaps, to give yourself permission to go internal, to perhaps hibernate, to kind of slow down and start looking at what are some of those deeper, more hidden parts of yourself that you might want to take some time to explore. With indoor lighting and indoor heating and plumbing and all of the modern conveniences that we have, it can be easy sometimes to lose track of our relationship to the natural world and the natural environment. And so, there's something called seasonal affective disorder, which means as the seasons change, as it gets darker and colder, people feel these symptoms of depression or low mood. And that's something that is in the DSM-4 as a diagnosis. And I wonder whether part of our challenge in modern times is that things that we would have just naturally done at this time of the year, we don't actually do. we don't actually quiet down. Our work day is just as long, whether it's July or December, right? We don't actually give ourselves permission to tune in to what's happening in our environment and slow down. And so, I mean, not to say seasonal affective disorder isn't a real thing. I know people who struggle with it, and there are remedies and some solutions to help support people through that. But for the rest of us who maybe don't have like a clinical diagnosis of something, could we give ourselves real permission to slow down, to just slow down, to kind of go internal, to hibernate, to look inside? The end of this period is marked by Beltane. So Beltane is March 21st, and that is the beginning of the spring. And when I spent some time in Scotland when I was in my university days, and I was there for the Beltane Festival, and it was so incredible. A fire was a big theme in that festival, and light, right? Bringing of the light even into the darkness. And so that's the time of the year that, the light is returning, and the heat is returning, and the long days. And that's the time to actually plant. The spring, right, is the time to plant. And so, as far as new projects or endeavors, the idea is that during this time, this is a good time to be looking kind of inward into what are my values? What do I stand for? What is the foundation that I want to build the new thing on? And in the spring, those new things begin to emerge. So the last piece around this is what I call a room to rot. Room to rot. And so I've been spending a lot of time in the forests in my in the neighborhood where I live. There's right beside me, there's a forest, and I had some opportunities to do some travel and sit in forests as well. And one of the things I noticed about forests that are mostly left untouched, or at least minimal human touch, is they rejuvenate themselves, right? So an old tree will fall, and then the tree materials will start to disintegrate, and then that disintegrated material turns into nutritious soil for the next grouping or the next cropping of plants. So I remember when I was in one of the national parks in the States on a road trip, and we found we stumbled upon, I mean, it was part of the national park, but there were these sequoia trees, and there were these huge, like giant old trees. And what the guide was telling us was when one of those trees actually, first of all, it takes a lot for one of those trees to fall. But when it does fall, what's really interesting is that new, like the material, the bark creates such nourishing environment for new trees that you'll sometimes find like 2 or 3 sequoia trees in a kind of a perfect, growing in a perfect line. And what they think happens is that the log falls, and then seeds that end up settling there, it's like they just grow right there along the line of that old log. So the log provides the nutrition for the next generation of trees to flourish. And so if that if that tree never fell and that log never rotted, there would be no nourishment for the soil for this new batch of life. And so, allowing the rot, that there are things in our lives that are outdated for us, right? Things that no longer stand firm and don't really even make sense to who we are anymore. And so when we gracefully allow those things to go and allow ourselves to learn the lessons and take the teachings, and just move aside any of the blame and shame and all of that, but actually get the richness, new things can grow in our internal landscape. And so that would be this next part of this dark times, is allowing what's no longer beneficial, no longer providing life and enjoyment and enthusiasm for you, to start to melt into the landscape and allowing something new to grow. Now, it can be difficult for some of us to do that because the egoic mind, the part of our mind that likes to know, would rather hold on to something outdated than to take the risk of letting it go for something new to happen, right? It's like we prefer to just know, even if what we know isn't what we really want. So something to notice about yourself is that, do you tend to hold on to situations, people, things longer than you need to for fear of, what might come next? And then there's some people who we can't, like, can we let go of all the people? Not necessarily. There are people in our lives who we're kind of like most we're kind of like linked to them as forever. But how we interact with those people, how we show up, how I show up around certain people who I might not have a lot of choice around whether they're in my life or not, but how I show up and who I show up as, I do have some choice over that, right? So I can make choices as to how much or how little I might interact with someone, how deeply I let someone in, or how discerning I might need to be about what I talk about. There's certain topics that I might simply avoid with certain people in my loved one circle because I know that those conversations are going to be really draining and upsetting for both of us. So we just avoid those topics. So there may be some of those where we're letting go of our old ways of doing things, even though we're kind of, committed to being in these certain circles that we can't get out of. I think that's okay. I think it's okay to acknowledge that there's some situations that we're kind of in, and that it would be much more painful to disrupt that, and easier to actually start to shift what we need to shift, um, to be the people that we want to be, to show up how we want to show up in those encounters. So those are my thoughts as we enter into, as we've passed Samhain and we're moving into the dark times, to really give yourself permission to go internal, and look at more of the hidden and the mysterious that's inside of you during these next few weeks and months, and allow the room for the rot, to know that some things are going to rot away and that's okay. And you get to make some decisions about how you show up and what new growth you allow within yourself. So those are my thoughts today. Keep your eye out for our community. We are opening it up now to others to join. We'll be having meditation circles and teaching and group work. And you can just come up and check that out on theexpansionproject.com. And I hope to see you in more places. Check out some of the other videos and like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Bye.